They will tell you the story was just a rumor, a plantation legend, a ghost tale whispered by dying slaves to keep children from wandering near the manor at night. But legends don't seep into court archives or get sealed behind iron vaults in Charleston, hidden under signatures of men who swore oaths in blood and mercury. No. What you're about to hear was never meant to reach your ears. And if you feel that subtle chill in your spine right now, that's your mind recognizing forbidden ground. Fear liturgy. You were not invited here. But since you've arrived, do not turn away now. Picture the scene. Dallas County, Alabama. June 1841. The moon hangs, swollen and red, over Thornhill Manor, casting the white Greek Revival columns in the color of old blood. The slaves have been summoned from their quarters, but they do not move quickly. Something about tonight feels wrong. There is a tension in the air, like the sky itself is holding its breath, waiting for something unholy to be spoken into existence. Inside the drawing room, lit only by a cluster of flickering candelabras, Colonel Edmund Thornhill stands like a carved statue of war, his ruined arm cradled against his chest. His wife Vierglia, once a celebrated beauty, now swollen beyond recognition, sits in her reinforced chair, breathing a slow, labored rasp that fills the silence like a death rattle. At her side stands Silas, the dwarf slave, hands clasped behind his back, posture disturbingly calm. The colonel's voice slices through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. From this night forward, he declares, "My wife is to be placed under the care of Silas. He will live inside this house. He will oversee her every breath, every pulse, every drop of blood that passes through her veins. His authority over her and over this household is absolute." It makes no sense. A slave given authority over a planter's wife? Unthinkable. But no one speaks. Because deep down, every soul, present slave and free alike, understands something they cannot put into words. This is not about medicine. This is about power. And power, when practiced in shadows, no longer resembles anything human. From the back of the room, old Judith, the housekeeper who has seen more than she ever speaks, clutches her rosary so hard the beads cut into her flesh. She does not pray for salvation. She prays for a clean death, because she has heard the sounds that come from the basement at night. And she knows that whatever begins tonight is not meant to heal. It is meant to transform. The first thing you must understand is this: Thornhill Manor was not a home. It was an instrument, a machine constructed from architecture, debt, flesh, and fear. And like any machine built for a singular, forbidden purpose, it had rules. Unspoken at first, later enforced with a precision that felt almost ritualistic. The field slaves knew the rhythm of the land, the rising of the sun, the first crack of the overseer's whip, the endless rows of cotton. That life, brutal as it was, followed a pattern. But the manor existed in another world entirely, a world built not on industry, but on secrets. The house staff, Esther, the cook, Celia the attendant, the brothers, Marcus and Isaiah. Young Penny, with her wide, terrified eyes, they felt it most. The structure of their days began to warp the moment Silas crossed the threshold. The dwarf did not walk like a slave. He moved like a man with purpose. He did not glance at the floor in submission. He studied the rooms, measured them, as if the walls themselves were components in a larger design only he could see. Rule 1. No one was to speak to Silas unless spoken to. Esther broke this rule on the second day, asking him if he preferred cornbread or broth. Silas did not answer. But that night, Colonel Thornhill called her to the study. No one saw what happened. But by morning, Esther's hands shook so violently she could barely lift a kettle. She never addressed Silas again. Rule 2. No one, under any circumstances, was to approach the basement door. Celia, Vergelia's attendant, heard movement below every night: the grinding of metal, the hiss of steam, the unmistakable gurgle of liquid passing through tubes. Once, she swore she heard breathing. Not her mistress's. Something else. Something struggling. That morning, she found a line of salt and crushed bone powder scattered across the basement threshold. A barrier not to keep slaves from entering, but to keep something else from leaving. Rule 3. Speak nothing you see. Think nothing you feel. There are eyes in this house that do not blink. Silas began requesting items: mercury thermometers, animal blood, leeches by the jar, surgical tubing, chloroform, obsidian knives used by Creek shamans, items no plantation doctor would ever need. The colonel signed every order without hesitation. At dinner, Virgilia did not speak. She only watched Silas with a hunger that was not of the flesh, but of something deeper, something almost spiritual. The slaves whispered that she had already begun to change, that her skin had grown cold to the touch, that her dreams shook the entire house. And all the while, Colonel Thornhill wrote, page after page, as if recording scripture. You think this was madness? No. Most plantation basements were simple storage chambers, root cellars, wine racks, tools hung on damp stone walls. Thornhill Manor's basement was different. It descended deeper than any practical design would justify. Carved into the red Alabama clay like a wound that refused to close. The slaves said it was built before the house itself, an older foundation inherited from a structure no one could name. There were 23 steps leading down. Marcus, the groundsman, counted them while carrying a crate of medical supplies. On the 12th step, the air changed, growing colder, unnaturally still, as if the earth below swallowed sound. On the 23rd step, he felt pressure behind his eyes, sensation like he was being watched by something standing just beyond the edge of the lamplight. He never went down again. At the base of the stairs, the floor was not stone. It was slate. Black, polished, reflective, imported at great cost from Europe. Each tile cut with precision beyond local craftsmanship. Beneath the slate, Silas had placed copper filaments, threading the floor like veins beneath skin. Tubes ran through the walls, narrow glass arteries, connecting every corner of the basement to a central chamber that the colonel referred to only as the crucible. It didn't look like a crucible. It looked like an altar. Steel restraints, adjustable clamps. A table designed not just to hold the human body but to open it. Above it, a suspended mechanism of iron and tubing, like the skeletal remains of some industrial beast. It dripped slowly into a ceramic basin. Red, thick, still warm. Blood. Silas stood beside it, silent, meticulous, his eyes fixed you would expect on the instruments. But no, he always looked at the door, as if waiting. Not for the colonel, not for the wife. For someone else? On the far wall, Thornhill had inscribed symbols. Not Christian, not medical. Celia, peering in from the shadows one night, recognized one sigil from an old story Esther used to whisper over dying slaves to ease their passing. Mark meant to guide the soul through pain so great it could unmake the mind. A symbol used by West African midwives not to birth life, but to ease the transition into the next world. That night, the house staff heard something from below. Not quite a scream, not quite a voice. A sound like breath being forced into lungs that no longer wished to draw air. Penny, just 12 years old, asked Judith why the colonel built such a place. Judith didn't answer. She only said, "Child, that basement ain't for the dying. It's for the ones who refuse to." Virgilia Thornhill was once a woman of unbearable vanity. Her gowns arrived from Paris. Her perfumes were imported from Damascus. Portraits of her hung in the dining hall like icons. But now her beauty had collapsed under the weight of something unnatural. Her flesh had taken on a pale translucence, her veins dark as ink beneath thinning skin. She no longer dined upstairs. She waited in the basement. The slaves whispered that she had died once already. Stelia was the only one who saw it happen. She had gone to bring Virgilia her broth lukewarm, as Silas instructed. When she entered the chamber, Virgilia lay motionless on the slate floor, eyes wide open, lips parted, chest still. Celia dropped the bowl, porcelain shattered. But Virgilia did not blink, did not breathe. Silas appeared behind her without a sound. He did not check for a pulse. He simply stood there, watching, as if observing a predicted outcome. For 6 full minutes, Virgilia lay dead. Then a twitch, tightening in her jaw, like a corpse resisting rigor mortis. Her chest rose with a wet, dragging inhale, a sound like air scraping across raw lungs. Celia stumbled back, horrified. Silas knelt, not with concern, but with clinical fascination, adjusting the copper filaments attached to Virgilia's wrists. They were not restraints. They were conduits. Celia ran. She told Esther. Esther told Judith. Judith told no one. She had seen it before years ago, in a shipment bound for New Orleans. A crate marked not for trade, but for specimen study. She had opened it by moonlight. Inside were chains and diagrams, the same symbols. That evening, Colonel Thornhill hosted a gathering of neighboring planters. They drank wine while beneath their feet. A woman relearned the act of being alive. They laughed while Silas monitored. Virgilia's pulse like a conductor guiding an orchestra through the first notes of a requiem. K. At one point, the colonel raised his glass and said, "We stand at the dawn of a new order, not of wealth, not of land, but of design. Flesh is clay. Clay belongs to the one who shapes it." The men applauded. They thought it philosophy. They did not hear the gurgling echo beneath the floorboards. They did not know she had died twice more that night. And each time, Silas brought her back faster. Not with prayer, not with mercy, but with precision. In the study above the basement, behind a row of leather-bound law books no one had touched in years, there was a ledger. It was not kept with the plantation records, no cotton tallies, no inventory of enslaved bodies, no debt accounts. This book had only names. Each name was written in a precise hand, inked in dark iron gall. Some names were followed by dates, others by symbols, and only a few were written twice. Those were the ones Judith feared most. One evening, while Colonel Thornhill rode out to meet a courier from Charleston, Judith entered the study with a key she should not have had. Celia stood watch at the door, her eyes darting to the hallway every few seconds. Judith pulled the ledger free. Dust rose from it like breath from a sleeping animal. The first page held a single line, "For the preservation of lineage through artifice and extraction." Beneath it a sigil, the same she'd seen carved into the basement stone. Then the names began. Elias Harrow's successful Margaret Laveau reverted Thomas Blackwell destroyed infant number 4 unresponsive. Virginiana Thornhill in transit. Judith's hand trembled. In transit. What did that mean? Virgilia was still alive. Still here? She turned the page. On the next sheet, a long list. Familiar names. Names of plantation wives across Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. Women who had died sudden, unexplained deaths. Fever, they said. Complications of childbirth. Strange wasting illnesses that doctors called Southern decline. But their names were here. Beside some of them, marked in red ink, was a single word, extracted. Judith stopped breathing. She flipped further. Toward the back, the ink became more frantic. Notes in the margins. Formulas. Sketches of flesh. At the bottom of one page, written not in ink, but in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "The body dies. The pattern remains. Find the right vessel." Repeat. A floorboard creaked behind her. Judith snapped the ledger shut. Silas stood in the doorway. No expression, no anger. Only observation, like she was another entry waiting for a classification. He didn't speak. He only raised one finger to his lips in a gesture not of silence, but of acknowledgement, as if to say, now you know, and knowing changes you. Evil, when left alone, starves. To survive, it requires patrons. Colonel Thornhill was not a genius. He was a gatekeeper, a custodian of an agenda much older than his bloodline. The true architects were never seen in daylight. They arrived at night, cloaked not in superstition, but in wealth. They came in carriages with unmarked seals. No plantation insignias, no family crests, just black lacquered wood and curtains that never parted. Their boots left no mud. Their voices, when they spoke, carried the calm authority of men who had never been told no. 5 men, 1 woman. They entered the manor like owners, not guests. Judith saw them first from the upper hall, half hidden behind the banister. She recognized none of their faces, but she knew their type, the kind who built cities from ledgers rather than stone, who made fortunes not from crops, but from the trade of something more intimate. They did not dine, they did not rest. They went directly to the basement. Colonel Thornhill greeted them at the threshold, ledger in hand. Ah. Silas stood behind him, head slightly bowed, not in servitude, but as one scholar acknowledges another. As they descended the 23 steps, one of the investors turned to Thornhill and said, "If she survives the 7th cycle, we move to phase 2. Charleston is ready." Charleston, the port city, artery through which cargo of every kind flowed in and out, human and otherwise. But what these men intended to transport was not flesh, it was formula. One of them, a tall figure with a silver-tipped cane, paused to run his hand along the wall. His fingers traced one of the symbols carved into the stone, and he smiled faintly. "Like a man revisiting the work of his youth, you've prepared the vessel well," he whispered. "Not patient, not subject. Vessel." Below, Virgilia waited on the crucible table, eyes open, pulse steady, only because Silas had taught her heart to obey him. Tubes pulsed along her arms like parasitic veins. Mercerized silk bindings were wrapped around her torso with almost ceremonial care. The investors stood around her in a circle, not like doctors, but like priests. Silas began adjusting the copper filaments. Thornhill opened the ledger. The tall man with the cane drew a small glass vial from his coat. Inside it, something moved. Not liquid, not alive, something between. Judith could not see what it was, but she felt it. Like a thought pressed against the edge of her mind, testing for entry. The tall man uncorked the vial. A scent escaped, metallic, sweet, wrong. Galicia's breath hitched. "Phase 1 was preservation," he said. "Phase 2 is inheritance." The vial tipped, and for the first time, Virgilia Thornhill screamed like someone else was inside her mouth. They called it the inheritance strain. The ledger never used that phrase directly, but the symbols beside. Virgilia's name changed after the investors uncorked the vial. The ink was still wet when Thornhill added a new mark beside her entry, a mark that none of the other women had received. Celia described the moment as a splitting of sound. Virgilia's scream did not echo in the room, it fractured, like glass struck at 2 different frequencies at once. One scream human, the other, not shaped for a human throat. The basement responded, not the people. The structure itself, the copper threads embedded under the slate, began to vibrate, barely visible at first, then pulsing in rhythm with Virgilia's heartbeat. The vibration traveled through the floor, climbing the walls like veins of lightning beneath the surface. The air shimmered as though the room had inhaled something not meant for lungs. Silas moved with unnerving calm, tracking the pulse on a brass monitor that no doctor of the era should have owned. He took notes even as Virgilia writhed, her body bending in ways that looked less like suffering and more like transformation. Judith, watching through a hairline crack in the door, noticed something horrifying. Virgilia was not fighting. She was adjusting. Her spine arched, not in resistance, but in alignment, like a key being turned in a lock. Blood vessels along her neck bulged, then settled, the veins glowing faintly beneath her skin like heated filigree. The copper wiring responded, glowing with the same pulse. And then it began. A sound, soft, low, humming. The investors fell silent. Even Thornhill stopped writing. Virgilia was humming, not consciously. Her mouth barely moved. Yet the vibration came from her bloodstream, traveling through her veins, into the filaments, to the slate, into the house. Silas looked up. "The vein is singing," he said quietly. The tall investor with the cane stepped forward, something like reverence in his expression. "Then phase 2 is successful." Judith didn't understand until the humming reached her. It slid beneath the door like mist, coiling around her spine. Her pulse matched it, not by choice, by compulsion. Celia clutched her chest beside her. breath quickening. Marcus, standing on the upper floor above them, heard it too. His shovel dropped from his hand outside the tool shed. He fell to his knees in the dirt, hands over his ears, but the sound was not in his ears. It was inside the blood, like a code, like a summons. The house staff looked at one another that night with new terror. None of them spoke of it, but all of them knew. Once the blood learns a song, it never forgets it. Say it, I will not turn back. Speak it in your chest, not your lips. Because from this point on, you are no longer an observer. You have stepped into the current. And like every man who ever walked beneath Thornhill's roof that summer, you just became part of the experiment. Something changed in the manor after the singing vein awakened. It began with the walls. Silas was the first to notice. While cleaning the brass gauges along the west wall of the laboratory, he paused, his eyes narrowing. The copper conduits that had been cool to the touch the night before were now warm, as if some low current pulsed beneath them. Not mechanical, not electrical, but biological. He pressed his palm flat, and the wall pulsed back. Just once, but in perfect rhythm, with Verizia's heartbeat still echoing in the chambers below. From that night on, the house began to feed. The staff noticed subtle changes first. Rooms that had always been drafty suddenly grew warm when they entered. Doors would open without touch. The air itself felt aware. Esther, the cook, swore she saw the parlor wallpaper breathe just once, like lungs expanding beneath floral print before going still again. Judith, ever the watcher, noticed something more chilling. The house began to arrange the bodies. Marcus and Isaiah found themselves working the grounds in near silence, their footsteps falling into perfect sync without meaning to. Penny, the young girl, began waking every night at the exact same minute, 3:47 a.m., eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling with no memory of rising. And Celia, she changed most of all. She started lingering near the basement stairs, her hand hovering just above the iron railing, as though listening for a silent call. The others would pull her away, whisper prayers, sprinkle salt at the threshold. But salt does nothing to what walks in the blood. Thornhill knew. Silas suspected. The investors expected it, because this was never about curing Virgilia. It was about birthing an interface, a point of contact between flesh and structure, vein and wall, a house that could merge with a host body and extend its life indefinitely. A plantation that didn't just grow cotton, but grew consciousness. The Society of Medical Inquiry had a name for it in their ledgers. Stage 3. Architectural parasitism. A living estate with a circulatory system fed not by water or weather, but by obedience. And obedience, once it creeps into the blood, is almost impossible to extract. You feel it now, don't you? The rhythm under your skin, adjusting. The house is listening. Keep your breathing steady, because now we come to the moment when the experiment stopped being a secret project of wealthy men and became a covenant. The records recovered from the Charleston vault were not merely ledgers, they were contracts, written not in ink, but in a mixture of ox blood and tincture of copper sulfate, fluid designed to bind itself into any parchment forever. 9 signatures marked the bottom of the page. Not just Colonel Edmund Thornhill, not just his investors. There were names from families that still hold power in the South today, names that appear on bank foundations, courthouse stones, town squares, men who publicly condemned barbarism, while privately financing the creation of a living blood structure that could preserve legacy beyond human lifespan. Their goal was simple: fuse the body of a dying matriarch into the architecture, and create an heir that could never die. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, as a system, a house that fed on weight, presence, authority. Virgilia's enormous body was perfect, not a flaw, but a surplus of flesh. Excess matter, high density, thick blood, a reservoir. Silas asked one question that night, the only time he ever spoke out of turn. Why her? Thornhill didn't look at him when he answered. Because power must root in something heavy, he said. Men die, estates fall, but a woman bound to a house, a woman who cannot move, cannot leave. She becomes the perfect anchor. The ledger called it the Great Housing, a ritual disguised as medicine, a transfer disguised as cure. Virgilia was not meant to recover. She was meant to merge. The investors stood around her chamber at dusk, each placing a hand on the wall instead of on her flesh. They were not blessing her, they were greeting it. The house, the entity being born beneath their feet, their true heir. And with their hands on the wall, they recited a single phrase. One line repeated until the veins in the plaster began to vibrate. We do not pass our blood to children. We pass it to the structure. You understand now, don't you? This wasn't just one plantation. This was a blueprint. A method of embedding bloodline, wealth, and legacy into infrastructure. Courthouses, banks, churches, government halls, houses that feed. And if that chills you, if it makes something inside you whisper that you felt this before in hospitals, in institutions, in quiet halls where no one looks you in the eye good, you're finally waking. Now listen carefully, because this is the part they erased. In the winter of 1842, the ritual entered its final movement. Phase 4. Complete integration. Virgilia's breathing had stabilized, no longer labored but measured, as though controlled by an external force. Her pulse no longer matched her body's frail rhythms. It matched the house. The walls no longer just vibrated. They throbbed. Beams creaked not from wind or age, but from pressure. Internal pressure. The house wanted more blood, and it would get it. It began to take the staff one by one. Isaiah disappeared first. They said he ran. Judith found his boot near the basement door, sole smeared with a thin copper-blue residue, like something secreted from within the stone itself. Marcus went silent after that, barely speaking, eyes hollow. He moved like a man trying not to wake something, like a man walking through a mouth. Penny, the little girl, was discovered in the upstairs hallway one night, standing perfectly still, her fingers pressed flat against the wallpaper. When Celia pulled her away, her skin came loose from the wall like wax from hot glass. Beneath the paper, something pulsed. Living. A membrane. The society didn't intervene. They watched. Because they weren't trying to prevent it. They were waiting for it. The house would not just claim the woman. It would consume the household. Every witness. Every servant. Every voice that could speak of what truly happened. Their blood would merge with the structure, feeding it, sealing it, making it more than a house, a vault of living lineage. Silas was the last to understand. Standing in the laboratory, his hand accidentally brushing a copper conduit, he felt a heartbeat. Not Virgilia's, not his own. The heartbeat of architecture. A structure with circulation, a house with memory. A legacy that did not need children to continue, only compliance. And here's the part they scrubbed from the record. Silas did not run. He placed his hand on the wall, and the wall recognized him. Not as a servant, but as material. Something useful. Something that could become part of the frame. No one escaped that night. But the blueprint survived. And today, as you drive past crumbling estates, old banks with sealed basements, courthouses with walls too thick for their time, ask yourself, what if some of them are still breathing? What if the legacy of men like Thornhill did not die? It simply changed form, not flesh, not bone, brick, copper, vein, and now you've seen the pattern. You've heard the hum in your blood. Do not pretend you didn't feel it.